Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast, the resource for transitional and experienced genealogists who want to create a successful business. I'm your host, Miriam Pierre-Louis. Here you'll learn from professionals all around the world who work in the field of genealogy. Are you ready to get started? Then let's get going. Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast. Today we head to New Hampshire to get to know genealogist Melinde Lutz Byrne. Melinde is the co-editor of the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, the NGSQ, and she is also the director of two educational programs, one at Boston University and one at Excelsior. Melinde, welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast.
A pleasure to be with you, Marion.
Let's get started by having you give us a picture of what the professional genealogy field looked like when you first got started.
Well, I really have to say I never thought I would be a genealogist. Certainly not at the time it fell upon me that I could actually make a living at it. Genealogy was hidden. The serious genealogists would publish in journals like the American Genealogists or the Register at NEHGS. There weren't many libraries which carried those publications. It wasn't until I was standing in the Portland Forum in the 1970s where I picked up a copy of Tag and realized that there was this greater world out there where people were actually doing this seriously. So I would say, aside from societies, in the 1970s, when I first became interested in genealogy, there really wasn't a lot of developed social or scholarly work going on. People who were publishing were still doing the same old thing that people had done for decades and generations, talking about their own families and not so much studying other things that were of interest in other families.
You have an item on your resume that's definitely intriguing for me. The Martin Finkham School of Court Reporting. What were you thinking when you went into that?
That was very practical skill that I developed. I always worried as a child what it was I was going to do when I grew up. And I had all these esoteric interests. I had a mother who stayed at home, but who published. I had a father who was a very skilled mechanical engineer, and they had raised me in such a sheltered way that it didn't occur to me until it was a problem that I was going to have to make a living at some point. So I was practical. At that time, women could be secretaries. And I had all the skills to be a terrific secretary. I thought perhaps the court reporting class would get me into the much more lucrative area where you were paid like a professional rather than like a secretary, who weren't treated as professionals in those days. It actually helped my typing skills, which converted to keyboard skills and helped me basically in my publishing career, because I could do things that other people couldn't as far as preparing a finished copy to send to a publisher.
From looking at the chronology of what you've done, it looks like you started doing genealogical work, and then you you entered into the doctoral program for anthropology. What was it that was directing you that way? And then the shift to archival management?
Well, it was never a very straight path, but I was very interested in anthropology in my teens, and in my 20s, I found that I could get a degree without taking calculus. So it was as much as anything avoiding calculus that drove me to get a degree in anthropology. I had some very good instructors at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. One of them was a student of Ralph Linton's, and that caused me to have a great interest in cultural anthropology. I went to graduate school and discovered something terrible, and that was that they were teaching me how to be an anthropology professor. They were not teaching me how to do anthropology. They wanted me to teach anthropology. The year that I entered that program, all my advisors were not given tenure. Margaret Mead died not too long after, and all the sharks came out and belittled her research. As soon as she was not there to defend herself, all these series of things really discouraged me, so I switched to library science because I really enjoyed research. The library school closed, so I ended up with a certificate. And right about that same time, I got a marvelous genealogical client who wanted me to write a book. And I did that instead. And as soon as I realized that I could do genealogy and make a living at it, there was no going back, no doubts whatsoever. That's the way I went.
The gravestone services that you provided, like I've always known that you were into gravestones, but I had no idea that you worked for Gravestone Services of New England doing gravestone preservation and cleaning.
I actually worked with, not for those folks. It all came about because somebody wanted to restore one particular cemetery and took it from a terrible mess, cleaned out the poison ivy, thank goodness, and got it on the National Register of Historic Places recently. So it's quite a transformation. But I think that the work we did surrounding the restoration of the Bradford Old Burying Ground in what used to be Bradford, Massachusetts, it's now a part of Haverhill, it is a model for anybody who's interested in seeing a graveyard restored from disaster. We did ground-penetrating radar maps. We did transcriptions of town records, church records. That's ongoing. We put the map up on the website. I started to study it in a way that I don't think many graveyards have been studied. I took the full descriptions of all the stones, and I determined what burials were done starting with the very earliest one. And I put markers on a map on the wall, and I did the first 3, and I said, what's going on here? Because you sort of figure they're all going to be sort of in the same place, and they weren't. They formed a really wide triangle, and I couldn't understand why these people were burying themselves so far apart. After tracking the first 40 or so, there was a real pattern of kinship. It wasn't a family plot kind of pattern, and there were a couple of anomalies that were very strange, but they all meant something, and it was almost like a cultural study of the graveyard from the positioning of each family and relative. It was very interesting and quite unexpected. I used to go out with Dean Crawford Smith to some really obscure cemeteries. We'd do videos of us walking through the graveyard and reading the stones into the video, because sometimes you get a stone that's not particularly visible on the video. All the work we did with that preserved some things that are gone now. In my own town here in Bedford, New Hampshire, I'm a cemetery trustee and a friend of the Bedford cemeteries. We go out and we take the stones that look like they're slate because they're so dark and dingy, and we turn them into the white marble beauties that they were when they were first installed. It's really quite striking. It's sort of like taking some of that liquid silver cleaner and dipping a spoon in it and pulling it out, and it's just all shiny and perfect. That's what D2 can do for marble and other masonry.
You did work with the New England Historic Genealogical Society, because I have this recollection in my mind that you were involved with the Great Migration Project. Can you talk about that a little bit?
When I moved from Oregon to Massachusetts, I got a wonderful job. On Saturdays, I was able to go into the NEHGS. I'd been a member for a number of years, and I had never been in the building. On my first visit, I was greeted by a wonderful, handsome gentleman at the door. On my departure that day, I discovered in my books a piece of paper with a wonderful invitation written in French to have soup and salad at a nearby restaurant from that same gentleman. I went back and I went to the elevator and the doors opened and there was George Freeman Sanborn Jr. looking rather downcast. He had seen me leave and I hadn't said a word to him, and he thought I'd seen his note. But from there on, it's all history. I never worked for the NEHGS, but I was on the Great Migration Study Project effort to get out volumes of The Great Migration Begins before a July deadline when the author was going to have a book signing at the public library in 1995 at the Boston Public Library. I came upon that because George Sanborn was good friends with Robert Charles Anderson, who later started the Great Migration Study Project. As the deadline for the 1995 book signing approached, there was great nervousness because the book wasn't done yet. All the advice to do it quick and dirty and get it in print fell on deaf ears for Robert, who really had his sights set on a remarkable product, and that's what he was going to produce. All those keyboarding skills and my genealogical background made me a perfect complement for the work he needed to get done in a short time. And it turned out to be a 5-year involvement. We got the 3 volumes of The Great Migration Begins out, and then the first 2 volumes of the next series. It was a marvelous experience. Really fast-tracked my appreciation for what can be done with a broad community-based study rather than just following a certain surname. At that event where the book signing was a part, I gave a presentation called something like Public Records, Private Lives. Afterward, a person who became a good friend of mine came out, Gloria Main, who's a history professor in Colorado, and she said to me, "When are you going to stop being somebody else's graduate assistant?" I kind of looked at her and I hadn't realized just how much being the secretary had been part of my career as a genealogist. I never turned back from doing stuff on my own right from that moment because she was so right. There was no reason not to do these things directly under my own power. And I did.
Let's go back to the 80s and forensic genealogy. Who were you working for? What were you doing?
After moving from Oregon, I landed in Boston, and I was introduced to Ann Smith Lanehart, who was a former NEHGS librarian and a professional genealogist at that time. A few months after we met, she was approached by Blake & Blake Genealogists, who were an air tracing firm with offices all over the country. She was asked if she would like to do research for them, and she said she would, but she wouldn't do anything like the amount of days committed to doing their work as they would like. But she offered to find 3 others who would work 1 day a week on tracing missing heirs. I was one of the people she asked, always looking for employment. I said yes. I was also trying to find private clients at that time. This is about 1983 or 84. So I was looking in all the wrong places for clients. It was a very competitive area in Boston. A lot of the things that I had in my mind were very professional, and people did not associate what you were doing with a professional rate of pay. One of the things I really worried about was my elevator pitch. What was I going to say to somebody when they asked me what I did for a living? And I would say, I'm a genealogist, and their eyes would glaze over, and that would be the end of it. I did, however, pay a lot of attention to other words. A family historian was an option, or a prosopographer, which would really glaze their eyes. But after about a year of working with Ann Lanehart and Bill Scheffler and Jane Bramwell for Blake & Blake, there really wasn't anything different about the genealogy we were doing on that one day, except that it had to do with the law. I decided that I would call myself a forensic genealogist. And I put it on my business card, and I started saying that. Eyes didn't glaze over, and people were instantly interested. And I'd get at least to the second sentence of my elevator pitch before I'd lose their attention.
During this time period, how did a theme develop in terms of what you were interested in? How did you discover that type of research that Melinde really liked to do?
Very early on, I was intrigued with finding women's maiden names, especially for the generations in the first, truly the Great Migration. I thought it's only fair that we know as much about women as we do about men. Among the places that I could go where the researching was almost untouched would be the court libraries or the archives libraries, and the court minutes from early, especially New England courts, the quarter courts, the general sessions, the common pleas. These were where the common people came and they made depositions. Such little use had been made of depositions and these court cases in research that in New England focused on maybe just the vital records, which were so easy to get in a lot of cases. Sitting there, I realized that there was a whole class of records that were fornication cases that solved a lot of these missing maiden name issues, and also provided birth records of a sort for thousands of children. So my first standalone publication, not for a client, was a very thin book called Lost Babes. And it was basically an index with a short introduction about what these records were. And it was all the court cases from the beginning of the court in the 1600s to the 1740s, when that kind of court appearance became quite rare. They simply didn't prosecute it anymore. I had an interest in my own ancestry, which was primarily in New England, and got many excellent clients from my association with the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And one day they had a great idea, which was to hold an auction to raise funds for the society. And I put in an auction item of a period of time of genealogy research for whatever price that would go for. I was fortunate to be bought by Dean Crawford Smith. And it turned out he had a great vision for a very long series of books on his mother's ancestry. And I was all in from the first moment, which was against all common sense belief at that time, was that you needed lots of small clients and you wanted to avoid the big clients. But I liked the large clients with something you could do a really thoughtful, wonderful job with. The publications that came out of that, which were 8 volumes of ancestry in the way of Walter Goodwin Davis's treatment of his 16 great-great-grandparents. Dean followed pretty much the same pattern. I think those were what certainly got the attention of the American Society of Genealogists, who look for people who publish a quantity of very high-quality works. And I was very honored after the publication of the second book to be elected a fellow of the American Society of Genealogists, which is a life election and limited to only 50 living people at any one time.
Can you talk a little bit about the American Society of Genealogists and their focus on publication as a main criteria for selecting fellows?
The American Society of Genealogists was formed by 3 guys in a bar, which is where all wonderful things really start. They had it in mind that they wanted a camaraderie of serious genealogists. This is about 1940, before World War II. They wanted serious genealogists, and really the only way in those days to determine whether somebody was a good practicing genealogist was to see their work. Since client reports were not usually bandied about publicly, the way to find that would be to see how and what they published. There was a whole number of journals that really benefited from people wanting to see their work in print, but not being able to afford to actually do a full typeset book. Many of the serious genealogists could be identified by what it was that they wrote. Part of the society's early rules that have been kept ever since had everything to do with what you published and very, very little to do with speaking or public service or volunteerism or being an officer or doing any of the many, many jobs that are now available for genealogists. If you don't publish, you don't come to their attention even now as a serious candidate for becoming a fellow. And it is quite the honor. I can recall in 1993 when I was elected, my first impression was, oh my God, I can never make another mistake. Because I'll be under a magnifying glass because people will look at what I say and take it to be true because I've achieved this honor. I can never make another mistake. The fellows continue. There are, I think, 48 living fellows presently, and we meet once a year. We give out scholarships to colleges and institutes that have genealogical programming. We continue to identify people who are writing good works with awards, such as the Jacobus Award for the best annual book published in the last 3 years that demonstrates skill in genealogical research. Usually it's a compiled genealogy, but there have been how-to books that have won that award. I was its president for 3 years, and the immediate past president. I so enjoyed going through the archives of the fellows and reading the correspondence and seeing mention of things that I never knew occurred back in the 1940s and the 1950s. A remarkable involvement with trying to raise the level of education for genealogists, and the work of Gene Stevenson is just remarkable and very little known.
If somebody today who was starting out in genealogy and they were dreaming big and said, oh, someday I want to be an FASG, what would you suggest to them?
You know, the answer would have been very different just 10 years ago, but my answer now is take a class. Doesn't matter where or what level, just take a class, because where almost all the fellows presently living were self-taught, myself included. The folks of the future will have taken standard education paths to becoming a genealogist. I think that is the smartest, the fastest, the most thorough way of approaching becoming a professional. Take a class, develop a network, join a society where the folks have an interest in what you're interested in. If you think you want to be a generalist, go for a national society. If you think you want to specialize in something like genetic genealogy or forensic genealogy, become a member or attend the institutes that focus on those kinds of specialties. The key word might be teamwork, because the future will not be one person laboring alone on a particular problem. Sure, you can continue to do that, but to get the best product out there, you need other eyes to look at what you do. One of the biggest problems the ASG has with assessing whether somebody's publications warrant their being elected is that most of the big publications these days are edited by somebody, and that editorial work is often what makes a good article great. Unless you talk to the editor, you don't necessarily know what that article looked like when it came in for consideration.
In 2006, you became co-editor of the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. Talk about your journey to becoming an editor.
When I was trying to decide whether to truly be a full-time genealogist, I looked at other emerging fields, and I looked for examples of what people did to become well-known and well-paid was really one of the concerns. And one of the fields that I was particularly involved with at that time was science fiction. A neighbor of mine in Eugene, Oregon, happened to be Damon Knight, who was a very well-known science fiction writer. He wrote a book called The Futurians. It was all about a group of people who in their youth and middle age had come together. They were all science fiction writers and had a wonderful decade run of deep friendships and development of their skills. In the end, Damon had actually become the better science fiction writer that he ended up being by becoming an editor. I looked at him as an example and I thought, all right, this is what he did. He had an initial interest. He practiced. He got published. He got published some more. He learned what other editors wanted from him, and that was his path. I was following the same path. By no means was the NGSQ the first time I was editor or even co-editor of something. I had, in the 1970s, been an editor for an Oregon Genealogical Society, and I was, at the time I was asked, editor of the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, and had been for many years. I would say practice, practice, practice was what was needed, but knowing a lot about a subject before you take an editorship is absolutely key.
When you are working as editor of the NGSQ and you're presented with articles, what is the most important factor?
I particularly value the complex problem solving that almost every one of our articles demonstrates. And when I see something that uses a very unusual source or that turns common knowledge on its head and demonstrates that, oh, this is not just an exception to a rule, it's a new rule, that's the sort of thing that gets my best attention. I think we have a lot of themed things that follow along in the pattern of what people write in their portfolios, so that the scope of the fourth and fifth assignments in a portfolio for the Board for Certification of Genealogists are usually the core of many of the articles we've finally put in print. But the things that come out of left field, so to speak, like the case of impossible proof that Sharon Sargent did on her solution to the identity of Misha Di Fonseca, get immediate attention. They go to the top of the pile. This is exactly the sort of thing we would love to see.
One of the things you'd referenced briefly before is the transition that the community has experienced going from self-taught to now all these educational programs. And you had a major role in this. You were one of the players in this movement to bring standardized education to genealogists. The first way you did this was with the Boston University program. Now you're doing a program also at Excelsior. So could you talk a little bit about this transition in genealogy and why you felt a program like this was important?
People have been doing the formal education thing for a very long time, but it hasn't gotten traction. I think the difference had a lot to do with technology and also a pent-up yearning for more than what you could learn in 1 week at an institute. Back in the days, the genealogical professionals would always want to go to the Mecca, to Salt Lake City, to do research. They would do things like find the time of year when the microfilm readers were not as heavily occupied as other times, and they set upon a time for rendezvous in January when most people were not thinking about genealogy, but recovering from the holidays, and maybe they'd be out skiing instead of using the microfilm readers. Over time, the number of people invited to Rendezvous grew and grew. Rendezvous was the name, perhaps not the first name, but the name I knew it by, where people who were professional genealogists would gather in Salt Lake City. It was not a formal institute, but you needed to be invited at first. You would sit in this long row of microfilm readers where you could turn your head one way or the other and there'd be somebody working on something you'd be interested in. And it was a very social and research-oriented time. Now, over time, there were dozens of these people going to Rendezvous, and the local society decided to invite them to speak. Part of Rendezvous became presenting a talk. More and more people presented talks, and some of them received payment so that it made it possible to go to Rendezvous. Over time, SLIG, the Salt Lake Institute on Genealogy, was formed. It became another one of these very popular institutes that teaches for a week. I always expected that a university would finally conclude that this was a viable subject. The one that came knocking first was not the one I expected. It was Boston University, and there's an interesting story behind that. In the 1980s, I was interviewed by a reporter for Lawyers Weekly. They did a full photo shoot, and I was on the cover, and it was a big story about forensic genealogy. I was just a small part of it. A local professor at Boston University, who was head of her department, saw this article and decided that was going to be her next career. And she became one of my apprentices. She went on to become a licensed PI and a very successful genealogist and a CG. She was at a party in 2008 where the director of the Center for Professional Education at BU was, either a bar or at a party. This is where great things happen. We should go to more of these. Dr. Murray said to Dr. Boyle, I think genealogy would be a great topic for a university course. And Dr. Boyle said, I am not the one to teach that, but I know who you should talk to. And that's how it all started. And we developed 2 courses. I think the 1,000+ graduates would say that it's a very strenuous boot camp way to bring yourself to the next level.
Seeing that BU certificate on somebody's genealogy resume really tends to open doors for people because people know exactly where they stand when they're presented with someone who has gone through a program like that.
And it's percolated into the general public as well. There isn't a month that goes by that somebody doesn't tell me that they got a job related to genealogy, usually in a library, but other places as well, because they had that BU certificate. We actually have employers who occasionally come to us asking for referrals to skilled researchers because they're looking for somebody to clear title or do usually forensic things. There are lineage societies that hire. There are public libraries. There are archives. There are historical societies. They all have paid positions where they're looking for somebody with that little extra something, and the BU certificate has been that thing.
Let's bring it up to 2015 now. Excelsior College. How is it different from Boston University, and what's your goal for this?
The Boston University program is geared to beginners who take the Genealogical Essentials course and to people with a certain few years level of experience who want to broaden their skills in all necessary areas of genealogy research. The Excelsior program is geared to advanced students or students who want very specialized instruction. The first 2 programs there are about genetic genealogy with Blaine Bettinger as the instructor, and a genealogy practicum where we do advanced problem solving. that I teach. There will be more programs like that from Excelsior. There's a prerequisite for the practicum, which is a CG, many, many years of practice, or the BU certificate. Genetic genealogy, there is a prerequisite, but it's not as stringent. I would say that the vision of one person made this possible, and that was Dr. Ruth Ann Murray, because when she moved from Boston University to Excelsior College in Albany, New York, it used to be Regents College. It's the perfect landing place for us to offer more advanced instruction in a semester-long program with a pacing that's about half the speed and demand of the certificate program at BU. They don't overlap. They are separate and independent entities. People with different goals will go to different programs.
Where would somebody like me fit in? Somebody who was self-taught, doesn't have a CG. What would you recommend to me? Go get a CG before I apply to Excelsior?
I think that because the goal of the BU certificate program is to mirror the requirements for a CG, I think you can get through the BU program in a well-defined 16 weeks and have all the skills to do the CG. And if you've not had any formal instruction on things like evidence and evaluation, I think the odds of you getting a CG without that instruction are very low. So without speaking directly to your example, but to somebody who's done a lot of research but not had any formal instruction, the citation system and the genealogy standards that are in use today and that you need to be successful with your portfolio for the Board for Certification of Genealogists are not the sort of thing that you can easily become self-taught to a proficiency that's going to get you that CG. You really, really would want some formal instruction. And if it's not the actual reading of it, it's being graded on what you have done as a practitioner. If you've published and been edited before, that's a good measure to go forward to a CG. But if you've not had experience with straight up instruction, the new way this is done is very different and very difficult to self-teach.
All right, Melinde, you've worked really hard today. I think it's time to take you into the lightning round.
Oh no.
Yeah, we're gonna get a little quicker here and put you on the line with some answers. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, let's do this. What was the one thing you were most afraid of in starting your business?
Starving. I honestly did not know that it would be possible to actually earn enough to be able to put my kids through college, but it happened.
What is the best advice you've ever received from someone else?
I think that would have to be Gloria Main asking me the question, when are you going to stop being somebody else's graduate assistant?
What is one specific action listeners can take in the next 24 hours to help them transition into a genealogy career?
If they haven't already taken a class, I would say take a class. If you have taken a class and you're not a member of a society, join the society.
What is your preferred social media channel to communicate with clients?
Email. The social media that I'm most familiar with is more casual. It's not client related.
And even though this is the lightning round, I'm going to interject here. The only reason that I am on Facebook is because of this woman you're listening to right now, Melinde Byrne. She forced me to get on it. I took on the role as publicity chair for the New England Regional Genealogical Conference. And Melinde just had this way of saying things gently but absolutely firmly. And she said, well, that's what you're going to need to do. You need to get on Facebook. She didn't know the first thing about Facebook herself, and it was years before she got on it, but she forced me on it.
But you were willing to do that.
If you can recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be?
Hannah's Heirs by Daniel Pollan. It's a marvelous story, quite an old story now. I think it first came out in 1986. It's a researcher in Boston who was presented with a 5-generation chart that led to real discoveries about early onset Alzheimer's. It's an absolute must-read for anybody who's interested in genetic genealogy and genealogy in general.
Give our audience one parting piece of advice and then tell us how we can get in contact with you.
I think I'd have to go back to take a class. It's not self-serving to say that. I find that the students in all the institutes and even just going to a lecture at a conference and taking courses and even university courses that end in a degree like the one at Brigham Young University. These are really important places to make contacts and get the wisdom of others who are either on your track or ahead of you or behind you. This is where you're going to learn the most, I think. And to contact me, I pretty much limit myself to email. While I've had websites in the past, I don't have one that I can announce right now.
Well, give us the websites for Excelsior and Boston University, or what do we need to Google to get directly to the genealogy programs there?
For Boston University, I would say BU and Genealogy. That'll take you right to the website that'll tell you about all their programs. And the same thing for Excelsior. Excelsior and Genealogy will take you to the descriptions of the courses being offered.
Melinde Lutz Byrne, thank you so much for being on the Genealogy Professional Podcast today.
My pleasure, Marian.
Our discussion with Melinde Byrne has taken us on a genealogical journey from the 1970s to the present. We learned about Melinde's interest in anthropology and gravestones and about the early years of forensic genealogy research. Perhaps reassuring for the rest of us, Melinde's career took a very circuitous route to reach where she is today. That seems to be the case with many of us. But with the shift from self-taught genealogy to today's landscape of structured genealogy classes, such as at Boston University and Excelsior College, perhaps it doesn't have to be that way anymore. We got some great insight into what it takes to be an editor for a publication like the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, as well as what you should consider if you'd like to become a fellow of the American Society of Genealogists. In news items, the call for presentations for the 2017 Southern California Genealogy Jamboree has been extended to September 2nd, 2016. This call for presentations pertains to the Jamboree Conference, the SCGS Genetic Genealogy Conference, and the workshops, as well as the 2017 Jamboree Extension Series webinar program. Speakers must submit proposals through the online portal, which can be found at callforpresentations.questionpro.com, and that link will be in the show notes. Many people might not know that there is always an open submission for Legacy Family Tree webinar proposals on their website. So if you're a speaker and you would like to do a presentation for Legacy Family Tree webinars, either a live presentation or a recorded one, then there's a link that you can go to on the website that's always open that you can submit proposals to. The live presentations are scheduled annually at this time of year, but proposals are also welcome and considered for recorded member-only presentations. So go to familytreewebinars.com and scroll to the bottom of the front page to find the speaker webinar submission link. Another legacy news item, the Board for Certification of Genealogists has formed a partnership with Legacy Family Tree Webinars to host and produce future BCG webinars. Members of Legacy Family Tree Webinars will have access to the BCG recordings. The BCG webinars are held on the third Tuesday of the month in the evening when they're scheduled. The next webinar will be on September 20th, and Rick Sayer will present Finding Evidence of Kinship in Military Records. The APG Professional Management Conference is coming up at the end of September. It will be held at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's going to be a terrific professional learning and networking experience. I'm going to be there. There's still time to sign up. Just head over to apgen.org/conferences for more information. During the interview with Melinde, we discussed the genealogy program at Excelsior College. There are new classes both in genetic genealogy and the practicum in genealogical research starting on September 6, 2016. The deadline for enrollment is coming up on August 31st of this month. I'll have the link to that in the show notes because it turned out to be more complicated than just giving a nice quick link here on the podcast. Or the easy thing you can do is just to go to Google and search for Excelsior and genealogy, and that'll take you right there. Just a reminder that the Genealogy Professional Podcast is back in Stitcher. Stitcher is a podcast player sort of like iTunes. I think a lot of people who have Androids use Stitcher. There was a technical interruption there for a bit, but it's all fixed, and you can listen to the show there if you're a Stitcher user. Before I finish, I want to give a shout out to a few folks who have left iTunes reviews recently for the show. I don't have their actual names, just their usernames, but I want to give them a little shout out anyway. I want to send a big thank you to DMS Suffield, iTouch1G, and Remembering Ancestors. I really appreciate you stopping by and leaving a review for the show. And more importantly, I really appreciate you actually listening to the show. For our action item today, it's an easy one. I want you to take a class or a whole course. Don't just research the possibilities, actually take a class. Before you start protesting for this reason or that, there are lots of free online classes. If you can listen to this podcast, then you have the ability to take a class. At the very least, watch a free webinar. There are lots of free webinars, and you can watch them right from your smartphone. Go to the geneawebinars.com website, and you'll see the full listing of them there. That's it for this time. Until we meet again, keep improving your business skills and take at least one step to push your business forward. The Genealogy Professional Podcast is a production of Fieldstone Common Media, copyright 2016. Executive producer, Mariam Pierre-Louis. Creative producer, George Edwards. Production assistant, Pam Wolos. Technical director, Jean-Luc Pierre-Louis Jr.